Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to your Daily Dose. My name is Jim Merle, and today we're going to be continuing our study from the book of James, particularly the first chapter. And today's section is going to basically go from verses 13 through 16. So if you want to go ahead and grab your Bibles, that'd be absolutely perfect. I would love for you to be looking at them while we're studying through these things. So whether it's a paper copy, a digital copy, a phone, electronic device, whatever, makes no difference to me. We're going to be looking at the text today as closely as we can. Now, with that being said, if you've already been enjoying these programs from the past, please go ahead and give this video right here a thumbs up, comment below, give me a little bit of encouragement so I know that we can keep on doing these things as you're interested in such. And it may be a great idea today to go ahead and share this video out so that others may see it and they may go back and want to watch the whole series. While you're doing that, you're down in that area below the video, hit the subscribe button. That would be absolutely perfect. That way you would be notified each and every time I put out a new video, which we're going to be doing here on a regular weekly basis. Now, I get it. The name of the program is Daily Dose. Don't be fooled by that. It used to be called that. I don't have time to do this daily right now. At least I'm not taking the time. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. But we're doing this pretty much weekly, so you can study along with me one day a week of your choice. I'll be putting the videos out around 9 a.m. on Sunday morning each week if you want to check them out in that manner. But anyway, with that being said, we're going to be in James chapter 1, 13 through 16 today, but we are going to read the context beginning in verse 1 to get down to that as we start to develop what we do today. So here's what we have. James, the servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, being perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Then he says in verse 5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask, verse 6, let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like the wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. Let no man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, verse 10, but the rich in that he is made low. Because as the flower of the grass he shall pass away. For the sun is no sooner risen, but with a burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falleth, and the grace of the fashion of it perisheth. And so also the rich man shall fade away in his ways. And then in verse 12 he adds, I think kind of recapping and reminding us of all that he said already, blessed is a man who endureth temptation. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that loved him. In our new section, verses 13 through 16 here, let no man say, that is no man at all, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted, neither will he tempteth any man. But every man is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust is conceived, verse 15, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Now we're going to kind of continue with the same pattern that we've had before. We're going to define, discuss, and then develop these points. And in this particular context, there are quite a few terms that we do want to define briefly so that I think we can really get a grasp, an idea of what is being said here. And the very first one comes there in verse 13. I'll just read back until we get to it. Let no man say when he is tempted, that's a key word, he shall be tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted, neither tempteth he any man. Now, all these words are pretty much the same. If you were to take time, and I'm no Greek scholar, and that's just the original language the New Testament was written in, but I'm no Greek scholar. But if you go back and dig in and look at these words and understand these words, the words that we're reading here in verse 13, three times, the word tempted, the word tempted again, and the word tempteth, that's where the ETH mean continues to be tempted or cannot continue to be tempted in this case. All of these words mean basically the same thing that we've already seen up above when we've been talking about trials, when we've been talking about temptation. Temptation from verse 12, for example, is one of those places. Each of these things, as we've already represented, kind of account itself back to the trials of Abraham. You remember how we talked about in the trial of Abraham, when Abraham was first asked to go out into a place and he knew not whither he went. He was tempted to do that. He did it. How later that when he was tempted by God, in a sense, to go ahead and sacrifice his son, Abraham ultimately would prepare himself to do that, would go all the way up on the mountaintop, prepare the altar, even lay his son on the altar and bind him up, preparing to take his life. Ultimately, God stopped him from doing that. Remember that. But that was a huge, in a sense, temptation of Abraham. But remember, as we defined the word then, we talked about how there are several different words that can be translated as tempted or tried or test, whatever. And each of these words, but depending on the context, determines what that temptation, trial, or test is for. And in the case of Abraham and those tests and trials that God allowed him or even put him through, in all of those cases, God was testing him in order to find him faithful, in order for him to continue to stand. And God knew the heart of Abraham and knew the outcome of such you can only know. And so for whatever reason, Abraham goes through with it as far as God is willing to let him go through. And then when God stops him, God counts him as worthy. God counts him as being faithful in that, even though he didn't ultimately have to perform that. Now, we don't learn all that from James. Obviously, it wasn't even mentioned. We don't learn it necessarily back in Genesis. We learned that from the Hebrew writer who told us that God counted him righteous for what he did. And so with all that being said, God is going to tempt, test, and we're using those words kind of interchangeably. God is going to tempt or test us in order for us to stand through that, to be tried, so that, like Peter says, we can be tried with fire. The idea is there that all the bad things of this world are taken away and the good godly things are left behind. So, we see all of that. But in this context, we've got the opposite of that. I think I may have mentioned before that if God tests us in order to have us to stand, it'll be made better, then Satan in turn tests us in order that we might fall. And here is an idea of what Satan is allowed to do that sometimes God is blamed for having done. And so when we see the word tempted, and tempteth, think about the idea of being tempted in one sense, in another sense being tested or tried. And I've said before many, many times, a faith that cannot be tested cannot be trusted. And so someone who claims that they're faithful and they love God and they praise God in every moment, that's all well and good, and I'm happy to see that. But wait and see whatever that person does when they're put through a trial, when difficulties, when problems, when hard times come to their life. How do they react to that? That trial is what is ultimately going to matter. So in verse 13, we see the word tempted basically being used. Interchange with that the word tempt, temptation, test, trial, that sort of thing. However, keep in mind that what's being discussed here are things that Satan's going to ultimately do to us and not God. And so in verse 13, that's kind of established that God is not being tempted himself, neither is he going to tempt any man. Now again, will God put us through a trial? Allow us to go through a trial, you might say. Yeah, he possibly could, but he's not doing that in order for us to fall. So the first word tempted right here in this. Now, when you get into verses 14, 15, you begin to see the process that takes place when a person is tempted, and if and when that person chooses to allow that temptation to take them down, basically, to carry them to the end of that, which is sin and ultimately death. And you see a pattern here that develops. And I'll be honest with you, the pattern that we see in this verse, albeit some would argue with it, some don't want to comprehend it. Myself, I don't want to see it happen ever in my life or the life of anyone else. This is a pretty difficult text to understand. Now, it's not that it's difficult to understand from the perspective of we can't know what God's talking about here. It's just a matter of a lot of times when we read texts like this, which basically takes all the blame that we might put over on Satan, or in the context that we might put on God and shake our finger at God and say, God, if you hadn't tested me, if you hadn't tempted me, I wouldn't have sinned and I wouldn't have fallen, I wouldn't be considered in spiritual death. A lot of times when we point those fingers toward God or toward Satan, we forget to point any of the fingers, any of the blame at us. And these verses help us, or should be helping us, to see that there's a whole lot of blame that goes on us. There's a whole lot of pointing fingers that ought to be going on back this direction as opposed to that one. And you've heard people say the cliche before that anytime you point one finger, you have to remember there's three more pointing back at you. 4 if you can get that thumb turned around, I guess. But that's that's kind of the idea. And I remember, not necessarily as a child, I'm a little bit younger than this, but I can remember seeing or hearing as a child about a man named Flip Wilson. And I don't know if you know who Flip Wilson is, that doesn't really matter. But I think he did this world a disservice when he made kind of a skit, a joke out of saying, the devil made me do it. The devil doesn't make us do anything and everything. Does he tempt us? Yes. Is he active today to an extent? Yes. But he doesn't make us do those things. And so we want to continue anyway to define this. We're kind of getting off track, or I'm getting off track here. But look at verse 14. But every man is tempted. Look at the next phrase here. When he is drawn away. Do you understand the phrase drawn away? The idea of being drawn away, and we're defining the terms right here, is really what we're doing. The idea of being drawn away literally means to reach out and to grasp and to pick up, or to pull in one direction. I've got 5 children, and out of the 5, 3 of the 5 are young. So 5, 4, and 3-year-old are the ages currently. And every single one of those 5, 4, and 3-year-olds, for that matter, my 14 and 18-year-olds sometimes do the same. They like to come up and they'll grab my hand and they'll say, "Come look, Daddy. Come see this." Or maybe they'll just try to grab my attention. They'll say, "Look, look, look." They'll be on the other side of the yard or the other side of the room, and they'll say, "Look at me, watch this." They're trying to draw me away. And in a sense, obviously, as a parent, that's a positive thing more times than not, that I don't mind. But I know that kind of draws a picture of what this phrase here, drawn away, is. Now, this is ultimately going to be a negative thing here. But to be drawn away literally means to be grabbed, to pulled, or to be led by the hand, okay? So watch the development here. He says, but every man, don't blame God for this, but every man, when he is tempted, he is drawn away of his own lusts, okay? So when we are tempted, we are pulled away by the hand, in a sense, almost to picture the literal sense. We're pulled away by whose lust? Our own lust. Now, what is lust? Well, I've heard someone say before that lust is the idea, literally, and he was using a male-female relationship. He said if you're a man and you're walking down the sidewalk and you see a beautiful woman coming toward you, and you look at her and you see her intently and maybe think, "Oh, she's pretty, she's good looking, whatever." He said it just is what it is. But he made the statement that when you turn your head and look around as she walks by and watch her go by, he said that was lust. I don't think that's really it, but I think that carries some sense. Not that makes it lust in any means. That's just a way of discussing this. But lust is something that once it gets your attention, it holds your attention, and it pulls your attention, and it maintains your attention. Now, I sometimes say, "Oh, I would lust," and I don't really say this, I guess, but I could say, "Oh, I would lust to have a piece of pizza today." No, because having a piece of pizza today is not sinful. Lust involves things that are wrong, things that are sinful, things that we ought not be following after, things that that even though we may be tempted to look at for a second or a moment, we should not be pulled away from. And again, that's the process right here. So he says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away, pulled away by his own lust. Look at the next word, and enticed. Now, the word enticed here is yet another word worth defining. It's an interesting word here that is used, James uses here by inspiration in the New Testament. And this word entice literally means to bait, okay? Now, I don't know if you've ever been fishing. I think most people have either been fishing or they know something about it. Maybe they've seen someone do it or heard of stories or whatever. When you go out and go fishing, when you get down to that water, whether you're on a bankside, a boat, whatever, you need to go there prepared with a bait that's going to catch that fish, okay? Just a few weeks ago, my daughter went fishing with one of her friends, and she's 18 years old, but she went fishing with one of her friends, and she said, "Daddy, I told him that I wanted to have a bobber on my line. I wanted the bobber so I could see if I got a bite." Well, I asked her then, I said, "Where did y'all go fishing again?" She told me. I said, "Were y'all fishing for bass?" And she said, "Oh, yes, we were fishing for bass." That's what they told me. We're fishing for bass. I said, "Well, bobbers are more for catfish. For bass, you've got to put a certain different bait in the water. Sometimes an artificial bait will do better. But you got to put your worm or put your lure or put your spinner in the water, and you got to work that. You've got to pull it that. You've got to really work to get those bass to come after. Now, if you're fishing for catfish, and you may live in a different part of the world and can think of something else, but if you're fishing for catfish, now that's the more slower pace stuff. That's where you have the live bait, maybe the worm, maybe the cricket, maybe a piece of bread or hot dog. I don't know. That's the things I've done in the past. But you put that worm on the line and you throw it in with a bobber, and it just has to kind of sit there, and it just, as it says, it just bobs, it just floats. And that fish, the catfish, is attracted to that. The bass may not be. The bass are attracted to the moving baits, to the baits that look injured, that sort of thing, that are active. But these two things, these two fish at least, have a different thing that entices them or that baits them. Now, with that being said, this almost makes this whole picture, and don't take me wrong in this, don't take it to an extreme, this almost makes this whole picture pretty relative to a fishing trip. You know, you think about a fish, you've got to go down to the water with a bait that's going to tempt that fish, entice that fish, whatever type of fish you're going after, and then you've got to work that bait in a way that does the same. Now, you think about that. When we are tempted, Satan is working the bait. Satan is enticing us. Satan, in a sense, has got that proverbial thing that we love, and he's kind of hanging it in front of us, just right in front of our noses, and trying to get us interested in such. The problem lies in the fact, however, that when you and I take the bait, that's when the problem goes in. Having the bait in front of us is not always bad. Now, it's not advisable. It's not recommended. But having the bait in front of us is not always bad. But once that bait gets in front of us and our lust coming from us causes us to want to go for that bait, that's when we run into problems. That's when this process continues to build. So just interesting words. The words tempted right here, to test, to try, to tempt, temptation. The idea of someone being drawn away, again, the word meaning to grab by the hand and pull. And then the word enticed here being defined in that it's the bait. It entices us to go after it. So we'll come back more to that in a moment. Let's look at verse 15 to define a few words here. Verse 15, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. Sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. So look at the word conceived right here. What does the word conceive mean? Well, you and I have heard the word conceive or conception before. The idea there is something that begins in the middle, literally. Now, in the case of conception, as far as a child, obviously there's a conception. And that conception within itself, that's the beginning forms of the baby, and the things grow out, and, you know, all of that process that goes on. When something is conceived in the mind or conceived in the spiritual heart, that is, the seed's been planted. The beginnings are there. And those beginnings are a part of what's going to be the ultimate whole. You know, if you drop a seed in the ground to plant a tree, it doesn't look like a tree right then, but the tree's in it the whole time. And how much that seed is watered, how much that seed is allowed to germinate and to form so that it can become that large plant, really, that we see later, then maybe that we climb in the backyard, is all based on how much it's fed, how much of the good stuff, the nutrients. Later, as it comes forward from the ground and springs out, it's not just the nutrients in the soil and the water that takes it. Then it's the sun that begins to bring nutrients to it and cause it to grow. You see, when sin in this context, when we are tempted, that's just going to happen. We're all going to be tempted, whether it by our own hearts, whether it be by Satan, or in the sense of testing, may be tested by God. Not necessarily tempted like we think about it, but there are times when that happens. And when it's a test for a positive thing, then you may point a finger at God. And the context here is negative. So he says, do not blame God for this. But one that is tempted is drawn away and enticed. And then when he's enticed, he or she is enticed, when that lust, and that's the one that's giving birth to this, when that lust is conceived, it bringeth forth sin. So there's a process here. It's a sad process, okay? The idea of someone being tempted, being drawn away, being enticed, that bringing forth the lust that conceives within that, and then sin when it is finished. Look at the word finished. The word finished here literally means when it's at the end of the road, when it is completed. When it is finished, when it is done, when sin has come in to our lives, or temptation has come in, when that temptation took us by the hand and drew us out so far that we began to be enticed by whatever sin that temptation is, or whatever temptation that would be. When we are enticed by that, that begins to conceive, and that conception can lead to the ultimate sin to be finished. And then it says in verse 15, the latter phrase, sin when it is finished brings forth death. Now, you don't have to go very far. Well, you'd have to go a lot of pages, but you wouldn't have to go very far if you're holding a copy of the Bible to go from James back to Genesis. What happened in the book of Genesis with Adam and Eve? Satan comes in the garden as a serpent. He comes in, and what does he do? He tempts Eve. He asks Eve, did God not say this? Why don't you just eat this fruit? And she replies, God says that we can't eat of that. We're not to eat of any tree, or we're to eat of any tree of the garden except for this one. He said, oh, no. You got to think this through. God's trying to hold back. God's trying to keep you from something good. He don't want you to be wise like he is. But through a process of time, she is taken from a perspective where he's over here. I'm trying to do a distance here. I can't do very far between the camera here. But she's here, Satan's over here, and there's a distance between them. Okay? And he's tempting her, but he's not able to do much. But when he draws her away and she moves closer to him, it gets easier and easier till she gets close enough till she says, that looks pretty good. You're right. I'm enticed by that. And then when she is enticed and her lust increases, she ends up getting with Satan, and that conceives, that brings out sin, and sin can bring forth death. Now, at any point in the process, hopefully, Lord willing, we'll be able to stop ourselves, be able to catch ourselves through the power and the strength of God that we find in His Word. We'll be able to stop ourselves and say, no, I'm not going down that road. I'm not going to go down that path. I'm not going to follow that pattern. I'm going to, snap out of this, literally, and I'm going to stop. I'm going to back away, and I'm going back to God. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. That does not always happen. And so these words here that we've discussed, tempted, drawn away, enticed, conceived, finished, death. We understand death now. For Adam and Eve in the garden, people often ask, was that physical death or spiritual death? I think yes. Yes. They didn't die immediately, physically, like you might have thought they were going to, but ultimately they did die. And ultimately, death from that consequence has come upon us. Not their sin being passed down. Don't misunderstand that. But as a consequence of their sin, death has come on all of us, physically. Spiritual death, if we repeat that pattern, if we sin as they sinned, can come to us as well. But the thing is, although physical death may never be stopped, and won't be stopped for that matter, unless God sends the Lord back or the Lord returns and takes us up as we are, Of course, that'll be in a different form, obviously, somehow. But unless the Lord returned today, right now in this moment, and took me before my physical death, I'm going to die, okay? But spiritual death, although it can and does occur in all of our lives to some point, spiritual death is something we can recover from. That's a lot different from physical death. You don't recover from physical death, but you can recover from spiritual death if God is involved. Okay, so that's defining some of the words. Let's discuss that. I think we probably discussed most of this while we're doing it. But anyway, to go back and look at this text again, keep in mind, and I didn't do this, but keep in mind that what James has said, verses 1 through 12, are not a total disconnect from this, okay? James started out by calling upon the 12 tribes of Israel to scatter abroad, greeting. He said, count it all joy when you fall into what? Divers or different types of temptations or tests. Temptation is still being discussed here. You go through that pattern, and he tells us that, temptation or test in our lives early in the chapter, that can be a good thing because temptation can allow us to grow, can allow us to be strengthened, can allow us to be better. Then he says in a pause right there, if you lack wisdom to go through this temptation, you ask of God about that. If any of you lack wisdom, ask of God. God will give you wisdom. But don't think when God gives you wisdom, if you don't use that wisdom, that God's just going to keep on giving and kind of the context leading up to this. He said a man is blessed, verse 12, when he endures temptation. So get ready, prepare yourself, prepare myself. I'm going to go through the temptation. Going to be tried, going to be tested, going to be whatever sometimes. But when I'm tempted, here's the principle here at the discussion. Verse 13 said, don't you blame God for that. God is not tempting us to fall. God is not tempting us to be brought into sin, left there for dead, okay? That's not what God's doing. But instead of thinking about God first, instead of pointing the finger and shaking your proverbial fist at God and blaming God, he said, take inventory, check yourself. Check yourself, test myself, and see if it's not the case that I'm going through this, that I've been tempted, that temptation is drawing me away, that temptation has led to lust that has enticed me, and then that lust that is enticing me is conceiving something. There's something being born out of that, and that is sin. So the father of sin is conception. The father of sin is lust. That conception brings forth the child of lust is sin. And then it's like a child, grandchild almost. If sin has another child, that child could be death. That's spiritual. That's not physical. But if sin had a child, that child will be death. And that's the process we go through. That's the process that we continue to repeat out of our own hearts, out of our own minds, because of our own lust. So don't blame God. Allow God to strengthen you through that. Don't point the finger quickly at Satan, although he's definitely a part of this. Think about your choice. I have to think about my decision. What can I do in this situation? How can I break this cycle? How can I stay out of it? That's discussing this in order so we might understand it. Okay? Now, what about delivery? One of the things I didn't point out when we were crossing it, we're going to define, discuss, deliver. Let's deliver. One of the things I saw in here that I'll be honest with you, I had not seen before, and I've studied this text over and over and over, probably hundreds of times. I've taught this text a number of times. One of the things that did not jump off the page for me, and I avoided talking about it earlier, I wanted to real bad. But look at the idea of someone who's drawn away. Do you see what happens? The best thing we can do when we're tempted is don't take a step toward it. Don't allow temptation to say, come here, come on over here. Don't allow temptation to grab us by the hand. You see, if we'll stay in the presence, in the hand of God, if I'll stay in fellowship with God, temptation is not so much of an issue. Temptation that led to sin is not so much of an issue. Sin that leads to death is not even an issue if I'll stay in the presence of God. But when I step outside of that box, when I go past the boundaries of God, where sin lies, that's when I'm going to be pulled so hard that it becomes so difficult to fight back, so difficult to get back. Not impossible. Not impossible this side of eternity, but difficult. And so being drawn away, what I'm getting out of this, and we're fixing to stop for the day. What I'm seeing in this is something for sure. I don't want to be drawn away. I want to be in the very hand and the very presence and the very fold of God to the point that I'm not going to be drawn away, that I'm not going to be pulled away from God. I want to be in the fellowship with God all the while. Now, if you'll put that back in context with verse 12. Let's read verse 12 again. I didn't put it in with today's context. I put it in last week's lesson. But let's put it back together. Blessed is a man when he endureth temptation. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. So we endure temptation if we endure it. And we don't run away. We don't run toward it. We don't run after it. We're going to receive a crown of life. What a wonderful thing. Folks, I hope that this somehow today, our study has helped you out a little bit. Again, if it has, please share this out with your friends and family. All I want to do through this is just to help us to dig into our Bibles more readily, to have a tool we can use where we do not overlook or overstep what's here on this page, that we trust God and we follow him. That's my goal. So until next week, I definitely appreciate you watching. Fight harder, friends.